من این چجوری ذهن ایرانی میشینه هم چیزی میسازه از ماتم. تا این چند روزی که من اینجا هستم و 3 روز قبل از اینکه بیام اینجا، چون از روزی که گفتم ویزا نمیدیم، من از صبح تا شب مسافرت میکنم، از روز اول ماه مه تا امروز، روزی از صبح تا 10 شب. الان که امشب از 10 شب هم گذشته. در تمام این مدت یک امریکایی این سوال شما را از من نکرده. این هم هوا هستی که شما شنیدید آقا، در روزنامه خوندید. چطور امریکایی خودش این نمیفهمه شما این رو به حساسیت دارید؟ برای چی؟ برای اینکه ایرانی باید حتما فکر کنه که ما تابع این آقایانیم، اینا باید با هم دعوا بکنن تا ما عمل کنیم. نه قربان، ما میخوایم اینا رو اسطوره‌اش رو تو ذهن شما بشکنم. اینا هیچی نیستن به خدا، تمام شد، منحطن اینها، در حال سقوط امریکا. امریکایی نیست، یک قدرت بزرگی که 10 روز آقا ویزا نداده، میگه ما میخوایم این موضعش چی بوده در گروگانگیری. من کسی موضع من نامعلوم بود یا این کاری داره که تو 10 روز طول بودی؟ این معلومه منحطه. تمام شد آقا، ببندید. داستان امریکایی در کار نیست. گروه پدر جمهوری خواه، گروه پدر چیزی تو دموکرات. من بیکارم که ببینم که این میره جلو یا اون میره جلو. یه کشوری آقا هست و نیستش، اینا به بازی گرفتن، پدرش در آوردن، الان منطقه رو تمام کردن آواره نشین. اون که عراق، اون که ایران، اون که افغانستانه. ما هیچ دیگه مسئله ندارم که به اونها نپردازم، ببینم آقای دموکرات میفته اینجا جلو یا آقای جمهوری خواه میفته جلو. عجیب حرفی واقعا. یک کمی این به این کسانی که این چیزا رو طرح میکنن نهیب بزن، بگه یک کمی شخصیت ملی پیدا کنید، یک ذره غرور ایرانی پیدا کنید. شما می‌بینید که یک کسی ایرانی آمده برای اولین بار در تاریخ یقه اینا رو وسط واشنگتن چسبیده. این برای شما مسئله نیست این که آیا این به سود این تمام میشود یا به زیان او. به قول فرانسوی الو بالا فرض کنیم اینجور باشه. خب حالا بفرمایید که من عذابی گیرم که ممکنه دموکرات استفاده کنه از این قضیه. خب بکنه.
Former Iranian President Banisadr, who is coming to the U.S. next week to push his own book, says Reagan supporters were in contact with Iran's leader Ayatollah Khomeini. 2 former hostages said they want President Bush to supply more information.
He denied that he was in Paris. He didn't deny that there were meetings between high-level Republicans and Iranians.
I'd like to see a full investigation in order to get out all the facts.
Because the hostage issue is so explosive, Democrats are not sure how zestfully they should hunt for a smoking gun that may not exist.
Work and talking to reporters from his hospital window. The President, Mary Tillotson, has more on his condition.
What you mean by proof? For example,
si j'avais parlé
if I had spoken,
dans mon bloc-notes que je publiais quotidiennement dans mon
had spoken in the article which I published daily in the newspapers
avant les élections de
prior to the 1980 elections,
que voilà, cette affaire d'otage
that this hostage affair could have been taken care of
décidé de manière que sera bénéfique
in such a way to be beneficial to Reagan
et contre Carter,
to the detriment of Carter.
Est-ce que c'est un proof?
Would that be proof?
Not by itself.
Pas en soi.
Alors si cela s'est suivi par le fait,
now if this were to be followed by the facts,
Reagan est élu,
Reagan was elected,
les otages n'ont été libérés que le
the hostages were only freed at the inauguration time.
Alors c'est un proof?
Would that be proof?
Well, that might be what we might...
Moi, j'ai pas parlé de cela dans ce livre.
I did not speak of that in the book.
Mais je le dis à 4 novembre.
But I have said it, that on the 4th of November,
j'ai rapporté au peuple iranien.
I made a report to the Iranian people.
Quelques jours avant de cela,
that a few days prior,
je me suis réuni avec mes amis.
I got together with my friends.
Et j'ai parlé de l'affaire des otages.
And I spoke of the hostage affair.
Et j'ai dit que voilà,
And I said,
c'est fait de manière
this has been done in such a way
que va aider M. Reagan de devenir président.
this will assist Mr. Reagan in his election to the presidency.
You ask if this might be considered proof, some of these examples that you just cited. Some might call it circumstantial evidence. But coming from a former president of Iran, dealing with a charge as serious as this, many in this country say, you need more than circumstantial evidence.
Non, c'est pas circonstanciel.
It's not circumstantial.
En face de ce président, il y avait
Because
Khomeni,
with this president, sitting across from me was
il y
Khomeni,
avait tous ceux qui avaient participé à ce deal.
along with all those who participated in these secret dealings,
Rafsanjani, Beheshti, etc.
Rafsanjani, Beheshti, etc.
Si c'était pas vrai,
If this were not true,
il n'attendait pas que je puisse sortir de l'Iran, mais
you didn't expect me to leave
le même
Iran.
jour, il demanderait de la justice.
On the same day, he would have demanded justice. He would have requested, how dare he make these statements? Where is the proof? How could he accuse us all of all this?
Jamais n'est arrivé. Personne n'a pas
Nothing
demandé.
ever happened in this sense. Nobody ever asked this question because everybody knew that I was telling the truth.
Let me ask you some simple questions. Did you ever meet with any American officials or representatives of the Reagan campaign?
Personnellement, moi non.
Personally, not
Mais
I.
ils ont contacté à
But they
Madrid
did make contact in
un de
Madrid
mes amis et en
with
Allemagne.
one of my friends and in Germany also.
And you spoke with these individuals who reported to you of their meetings with Reagan campaign officials.
Ils ont dit tous les deux que
Yes, they both said
ils nous proposent un dealing.
that they were proposing a deal.
Moi-même, il y avait une menace.
There was a threat.
Si vous accordez pas,
If you possibly don't
nous
remember,
ferons avec les autres.
they might, or if you don't agree, they might make the deal with somebody else.
And what was that deal that was being proposed?
C'était de faire retarder la libération des otages.
The deal was to retard the freeing of the
Et comme
hostages.
contrepartie, ils
And
nous
in exchange,
assuraient
they
que nous
assured us
recevrons assez d'armes pour
that we would receive
finir
sufficient
avec la
weapons
guerre
shipments to
Iran-Irak.
end the Iran-Iraq war.
Let me read again from your book, if I may. This is from the foreword. It is written by Bruce Langan, who was himself held hostage and was the ranking diplomat in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And he writes that this is not to suggest that, and I quote now, that the U.S. publisher or I draw the same conclusions that Banisadr does, nor do we feel that his evidence is always convincing. That's in the foreword of your book.
Vous savez, ça, préface, il a fait écrire par quelqu'un qui lui m'a mis
He had that preface written by somebody who saw it his way,
de quelque manière otage.
who might have also been a hostage.
C'est ça, justement, cette introduction qui m'a assuré
And this is the introduction that assured me
d'une chose essentielle,
of an essential
c'est
fact,
que lui et
and
les
that
autres
is
Américains
that he, along with the
savent
other
pas qu'est-ce que c'est
Americans,
ce livre.
do not exactly know what this book is all about.
Il imagine que si je fais un mémoire,
They are imagining, they're thinking that I drew a diary.
c'est pas du tout ça,
This
c'est
is
un
not a
rapport
diary.
de laboratoire.
This is a laboratory report.
C'est-à-dire tous les
In other
jours,
words,
je publiais les
I
informations,
was publishing news every day.
je le suivais par les faits,
I followed the events.
et je les corrigeais.
I corrected them as they went.
Et voilà, ce livre dit comment
And
cela
this book
s'était.
tells how this came about.
C'est cela que M. Langen n'a pas compris.
This is what Mr.
Il a
Langen
imaginé
failed to
que je faisais
understand.
un
He
histoire
thought that I was just writing a
personnelle,
personal history of the
donc
affair,
c'est spéculatif.
and he was basically speculating.
Pas du tout.
Are you trying to, in any way, cast an historical shadow over Ronald Reagan? Is there a personal vendetta or edge to this for you?
Si je voulais me venger,
In a way, yes, I did want to avenge
je ne le
myself.
publiais pas à 89.
I did not publish this in
Je le
89.
publiais à 81.
I would have published it in 81.
But
once I had left Iran, there was an American publication which proposed to me, which offered me a very large amount of money. But I did not think it was to the best interest of my country, because Iran was in the war. And I did not want to destroy the morale of our soldiers and of our people. And I did not want Khomeni to surrender. So I waited until the war ended. And then I said, also, when Mr. Reagan was no longer president, Mr. Khomeni was already dead, there is nobody else for me to avenge myself against.
So now you avenge. We're going to take a break. We're going to continue our conversation with former Iranian President Abulhassan Banisadr, who writes a tough book. We'll be back after this. Your documents reveal.
They reveal the contracts, they reveal the weapons lists, as well as the amounts, the money amounts of the accords that were signed.
And when are those documents dated?
9 March 1981.
And why have those documents not surfaced before this time?
Well, they have surfaced, and unfortunately, there's a complete censorship here in the United States. For example, I have a number 55 where we were getting to the solution of the hostage problem, and there was a sabotage on the part of the American side. So have no American newspapermen been interested in this fact up until now?
Are you meeting with members of Congress?
Yes, I am.
And what will you tell them?
I will tell them that if the political basis is not moral, then this could be the result. Look at the results of a secret deal. You have a dictatorial regime in Iran, which carried out an 8-year destructive war, which destroyed a whole generation. Let's say, an economic situation which is totally disastrous.
You want the Congress to investigate this whole thing? Is that your choice?
I think I have the right to follow this up because I was elected by my people. Every elected president has the same responsibility.
Well, you're not elected anymore, but we'll push on to something else. Let me ask you one of the very serious charges that surfaces in and around this book and other contentions, that George Bush, the President of the United States, attended one of these meetings in October of 1980. He absolutely and vehemently denies that. Are you suggesting that this meeting happened and that George Bush is lying to the world?
Monsieur Bush n'a pas dénié d'avouer qu'il y avait.
He has not denied it. He never denied that there was such a meeting.
Il dit que lui, il n'était pas présent.
He has just denied being there.
Mais j'ai jamais dit que sûrement il était là.
And in fact, I have never said that for sure that he was there.
Il y a deux hypothèses.
There are two hypotheses.
Une hypothèse qui dit que c'est
one hypothesis which states that it was Bush's friends who built this thesis. And then they denied it all and said that nothing happened. There is another theory which says, no, he was there in person. Some sources say, yes, he was there. I would say that I am not sure. In my book, I say that, as I've always stated.
Well, Abulhassan Banisadr, your book is entitled My Turn to Speak. You are certainly...
January 20th, 1981 was Jimmy Carter's last day in office.
Mr. President, are the hostages out?
Answer yes.
Not yet, Sam. Not yet.
For the past 444 days, he had struggled and failed to free American hostages held in Iran.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Hatfield, Mr. Chief Justice, Mr. President.
Then, only minutes after Ronald Reagan began his inaugural address, the hostage ordeal finally came to an end. At the time of the hostage release, most Americans were simply relieved the ordeal was over. But a few people wondered about the extraordinary coincidence.
When the hostages were released just 30 minutes after Ronald Reagan became president, the timing seemed peculiar.
Gary Sick was a naval officer and Middle East expert assigned to Jimmy Carter's National Security Council staff. He was the White House point man on the hostage crisis.
We had reports later on that the people holding the hostages, in fact, were standing with watches waiting at the airport to make sure that the time had passed, that Carter was no longer president, before releasing the hostages. That could have been explained simply on the grounds that they detested Jimmy Carter and that this was just one more turn of the knife. But it did strike many, many people as peculiar, the timing of the thing and the way the Iranians worked it out. And a lot of people suspected right then that some kind of a deal had been done.
Was there a deal? Did the Reagan campaign tamper with the hostages' fate? Secret meetings in Europe, the Middle East, and Washington have been alleged, but definitive evidence remains elusive. For 6 months, Frontline investigated the allegations. In tonight's report, an examination of the mysteries surrounding the hostages' release. When the hostages were seized in November of 1979, the Carter White House was stunned. The president moved quickly to punish Iran, freezing Iranian assets, branding Iran a terrorist state, and halting all arms deliveries. He hoped that these actions would force a quick resolution to the crisis. Judy Powell was President Carter's press secretary.
The point of doing it was, if, when you release the hostages, then we can consider releasing your funds, releasing your arms that have already been paid for, and that sort of thing. So that was clearly sitting there, and indeed that's the reason you take the step of imposing an embargo is that it is a stick while it lasts, and it's a carrot if the other side does what you want them to do in the end.
In fact, I think that our strategy on that, though it didn't work, wasn't bad in the sense that there are very few countries in the world that would have taken the kind of beating that Iran took between November of '79 and January of 1981 to make a political point. But Iran was a revolutionary society, and revolutionary societies are slightly crazy, and Iran was slightly crazy at that time.
Through the first few months of the hostage crisis, the nation rallied round the president. But as efforts to resolve the situation peacefully floundered, President Carter made a fateful judgment.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. It was my decision to cancel it when problems developed in the placement of our rescue team for a future rescue operation. The responsibility is fully my own. In the aftermath of the attempt, we continue to hold the government of Iran responsible for the safety and for the early release of the American hostages who have been held so long.
The fiasco in the desert bolstered the Republicans' complaint that the country had grown weak under Jimmy Carter. The failure of the mission and the death of 8 American servicemen played into the hands of the Reagan campaign, now under the direction of William Casey.
When Governor Reagan asked me to undertake the management of his campaign, I accepted enthusiastically.
William Casey had served in World War II as a spy master with the OSS, the CIA's forerunner, and would later run the CIA for the first 6 years of the Reagan administration.
I feel very strongly that this country is in trouble, that it needs to be turned around, and I have felt for over a year that Governor Reagan is the only man in America who's ever turned the government around.
Disdain for Jimmy Carter was shared by many conservatives in Europe and Israel. In early July, Casey traveled to London and Paris to enlist the support of European politicians. Albert Jolis, along on the trip, had served with Casey in the OSS.
You know, he was over there on a 3-day visit, and it was all compressed into a highly concentrated 3 days. There wasn't much sleeping going on, and he said, I got to see Mirange, and he went off and saw Mirange. I don't know where he saw him.
Count Alexandre de Mirange was the chief of French intelligence, another staunch anti-communist. Mirange declined to be interviewed, but his name would surface later in claims that French intelligence helped Casey delay the hostage release. The meeting with Mirange fit Casey's pattern of erratic disappearances that became legendary within the campaign.
I must say, Bill Casey to me was sort of a mystery man. You know, he was here, he was there, he was around.
Retired Admiral Robert Garrick was an aide at Reagan campaign headquarters where Casey had his office.
He had his own driver, and the car would whip away, and the driver brought him to these meetings when he showed up. The way he deported himself, you never knew exactly what he knew, but you sometimes felt he knew something, and he'd tell you at the appropriate time.
You know, there's been a lot of propaganda about Bill Casey. People haven't liked him because of his policies. And because of that, they have sought to picture him as a corner cutter and a fellow who would maybe not be too fussy about the ethics of the issue and things like that. That's just sour grapes, as far as I'm concerned. It just wasn't so. He was an honorable man and highly honorable, ethical principles. But getting things done meant either getting around the red tape or cutting through it or ignoring it. But he couldn't stand the red tape.
While Casey was meeting in Europe, another development was taking place in the Middle East, a development that was alarming America's ally, Israel.
But suddenly information starts coming in that the Iraqis are preparing for war against Iran. They want to take over Khuzestan, the oil-rich southern province of Iran.
Ari Ben Menashe was an Israeli intelligence officer attached to the Israeli Defense Forces.
We start seeing hard intelligence that the Iraqis were preparing for war. And the Israelis were extremely worried about that. They did not want, in no way, the Iraqis to be an overwhelming power in the Middle East.
By early 1980, Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin was hearing Iranian appeals for military equipment.
Their biggest worry was the Air Force. They had no tires. Their F-4s had flat tires. They were not in good condition. They were looking for spare parts, tires, and wheelbases. These were their first inquiries. And we sold them the tires.
The tire sale did not please President Carter.
There had been a rather tense discussion between President Carter and Prime Minister Begin in the spring of 1980, in which the president made clear that the Israelis had to stop that, and that we knew that they were doing it, and that we would not allow it to continue, at least not to allow it to continue privately and without the knowledge of the American people.
Although Begin agreed to Carter's demand, the confrontation revealed the divergent interests of the two nations regarding Iran.
I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
On July 17th, the Republican convention nominated Ronald Reagan as its candidate for president. When Reagan's former rival, George Bush, became the vice presidential nominee, he brought with him strong support from the intelligence community. Within the spy agency itself, contempt for Carter and endorsement of Bush were literally written on the walls. Senate staffer Angelo Codevilla was a frequent visitor to CIA headquarters.
And therefore, there were signs. There were George Bush signs. There were Reagan-Bush posters cut off in the middle, with only the right side, i.e., the George Bush side, up all over the agency. One could walk the halls of the CIA and see George Bush signs all over the place. And George Bush was the aristocratic white knight of the CIA.
Many in the spy agency were unhappy. Carter's CIA director, Stansfield Turner, had laid off CIA officers and scaled back covert operations.
I think there's several factions within the agency, and people tend to call one of them the agency. That one is the Operations Directorate, which is a very conservative organization and was strongly pro-Reagan. It happens that the Operations Directorate tends to attract people who are more inclined to be conservative than liberal.
Carter was a utopian. He believed, honestly, that you must do the right thing and take your chance on the consequences. He told me that. He literally believed that. Whereas
Miles Copeland, a veteran CIA officer, had served in Middle East hotspots. In 1953, Copeland participated in the overthrow of the Iranian government, returning the Shah to power.
Carter really believed in all the principles that we talk about in the West. As smart as Carter is, he did believe in mom, apple pie, corner drugstore, and those things that are good in America are good everywhere else. There were many of us, myself, along with Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Archie Roosevelt, and the CIA at the time, we believed very strongly that we were showing a kind of weakness which people in Iran and elsewhere in the world hold in great contempt.
But probably the worst thing is what has been done to this country on the international scene.
On the campaign trail, candidate Reagan hammered away at Jimmy Carter, echoing the views of conservatives in the spy agency.
This country that all the world turned to and looked to. Today, our friends don't know whether they can trust us, and certainly our enemies have no respect for us.
In spite of their lack of respect for Carter, the Reagan inner circle feared that the president might still pull off a deal.
There was concern on their part that President Carter and some of his people might try to arrange a release of the hostages timed so as to have a major effect on the election.
Morton Anderson was a senior Reagan campaign advisor.
And if you think back to 1980, if in fact they had been able to arrange that, either by releasing some of the money that the United States was holding that belonged to the Iranians, or by giving the Iranians weapons or whatever, it would have caused us quite a big fuss then.
There was honest-to-goodness fear. I mean, there was, no one lay awake at night trembling, but it was an honest-to-goodness concern. After all, democracy...
Senate staffer Angelo Codevilla was also an informal advisor to the Reagan campaign.
All of those hostages. After all, democracies are notoriously unpredictable. And who knows that the sight of all of those hostages whose captivity had been page one news for many months, who knows that the sight of those hostages might not have redounded to Carter's favor.
In fact, Carter did turn to the CIA for help in getting the hostages freed. In one of its operations, the CIA tried to influence the outcome of the Islamic Republic's first presidential election in late January 1980. The two frontrunners were ابولحسن Banisadr and Admiral Ahmad Madani, former Iranian defense minister.
There were definitely contacts between supporters of Admiral Madani and the U.S. government during that period of time. His candidacy was viewed with favor in the United States, and he had people in the United States who came over representing him, looking for support, who in fact ended up staying for a very long time. One of those people was Jamshid Hashemi.
Jamshid Hashemi was a wealthy Iranian businessman who dabbled in politics and maintained close contacts with the revolutionary government of Iran. Jamshid, along with his younger brother Cyrus, funneled CIA money to their old friend Madani.
During that time, the Hashemis were trying to help me. I knew the Hashemi brothers from childhood. They were very old friends, family friends, but they were not disciplined. I advised them that they must be disciplined in their approaches to others, not a two-faced approach, but an approach based upon certain principles.
Despite CIA support, Madani lost to Banisadr in the Iranian elections. But the Hashemi brothers did not disappear. Younger brother Cyrus, a London banker, became an intermediary between the Carter State Department and the Khomeini government. Cyrus appears to have offered his services to the Reagan campaign as well. In an off-camera interview, Cyrus's brother Jamshid claimed he put Casey in direct contact with Cyrus. Jamshid says he was approached by Casey at Washington's Mayflower Hotel in March 1980. Casey wanted to discuss some political matters. I cut him short. I said, "I don't know who you are." I called Cyrus and told him, "There's this gentleman here." Cyrus talked to Mr. Casey. For the past 2 years, Gary Sick has been researching a book on this behind-the-scenes hostage intrigue.
But my sort of working hypothesis at this point, based on conversations with a number of people, is that that William Casey made contact with Cyrus Hashemi, this Iranian guy, and that contact blossomed over time without the knowledge of the U.S. government. So that in effect we had this man who, well, I think you could say, without stretching the term, that he was a double agent, that he was working for the U.S. government, but he was providing information on the side to the Reagan campaign.
Not only was Cyrus providing information, but Jamshid told Frontline that Cyrus had gone beyond just talk. He was trying to broker a highly unusual, possibly illegal deal between the Reagan campaign and the Iranian government. Jamshid said that in July 1980, Cyrus asked him to bring Iranian cleric Mehdi Karoubi out of Iran for a meeting at the Ritz Hotel in Madrid, Spain. Karoubi, now Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, was then a rising star among the radical Islamic fundamentalists close to Ayatollah Khomeini. According to Jamshid, the Americans at the meeting were Bill Casey and a senior CIA officer. Jamshid told his brother that he was surprised the contacts with the Reagan campaign had gone so far. I remember saying, "What the hell are you doing with Republicans?" My brother said the chances of Republicans getting into power were good, and that it was important to work with both sides. Jamshid described Casey's proposal in Madrid as blunt. Casey said the Iranians should hold the hostages until after the election, and the new Reagan administration would feel favorably towards Iran, releasing military equipment and the frozen Iranian assets. Jamshid told Frontline that Karoubi took the proposal back to Ayatollah Khomeini and returned several weeks later in August for a second meeting in Madrid with Casey. Jamshid claimed he witnessed this second meeting as well. Karoubi expressed acceptance. The hostages would be released after Carter's defeat. Jamshid gave Frontline an on-the-record interview in London, but refused to appear on camera. His brother Cyrus died in 1986. But there are others who claim knowledge of Karoubi's role in the Madrid meetings.
Whenever there is any contact overseas or with foreign governments, he is like a nominated official by the inner group of the Iranians.
Arms dealer Arif Durrani is now serving a 10-year sentence in federal prison for selling military hardware to the Khomeini regime. When asked about Karoubi, Durrani volunteered information which seemed to confirm Jamshid Hashemi's story.
Karoubi also had meetings in Spain. That is from where all these contacts started with.
Do you remember when those were?
I do not recall the exact dates.
And you were told this by whom?
by Rafiq Dost and Mohsen Razai and the Revolutionary Guard officials.
Did they say who the meetings in Spain were with?
I have been told they were directly with Director Casey at one time.
Israeli intelligence officer Ari Ben-Menashe claimed that he saw intelligence reports about Casey's trip to Madrid.
The Americans agreed to release money and make promises for the future when Reagan, Bush take over to make relations better. And the Iranians just promised to release the hostages. And the Americans also promised that they will allow arms shipments to Iran. Indirect arms shipments to Iran. And this is why Israel was brought in.
If the allegations of secret meetings in Madrid are true, it means that William Casey and the Reagan campaign were running their own foreign policy, undermining the efforts of legitimate authorities to gain freedom for the hostages. William Casey died in 1987, never having commented publicly on these accusations. His widow, Sophia, told Frontline she is sure that her husband did not travel to Europe to delay the hostage release.
But I know for certain he would never do a thing like that. He was great compassion for the hostages, and he would not delay their getting out of that terrible situation for 1 minute. He would never do that. He would find that very, very, very wrong.
So in terms of the possibility that he might have talked to Iranians, that would not be out of the question in your mind?
Oh, he would talk to Iranians, sure. He had no reason not to.
With gratitude and with determination, I accept your nomination.
In August 1980, the Democratic Convention renominated Jimmy Carter as its candidate for president. Carter still trailed Ronald Reagan, but was gaining in the polls. As the president's re-election prospects brightened, the Iranians reopened stalled talks with the White House. Whether the Iranians were hedging their bets by trying to strike similar deals with both sides, or simply trying to resolve the crisis as soon as possible, Ayatollah Khomeini offered Carter a deal. Sadr Tabatabai, a young businessman related to Khomeini through marriage, carried the Ayatollah's message to the Carter administration.
We were told by Tabatabai that Khomeini would set the terms in a public statement. Then we knew we had a reasonable negotiating position, because here we had a man who forecast this, who appeared to have some authority and status with Khomeini, and that led to what could have been a very fruitful situation.
In an off-camera interview with Frontline in Germany, Tabatabai said that his meetings with the State Department quickly produced the framework of an agreement. At the end of the talks, I was very optimistic. Carter had accepted the conditions set by the Iranians. The Iranian offer mirrored the agreement that Casey had allegedly accepted in Madrid. The deal would have released frozen money and weapons in return for the freedom of the Americans. But it would have done so immediately, at a time when the Iranians had urgent need for military hardware. In mid-September, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, just as the Israelis had feared. At this point, the Iranians seemed to have every reason to settle up, deliver the hostages, and get their arms. As the election neared, the Reagan campaign remained alert, ever fearful that the unpredictable Iranians could tilt the election Carter's way by releasing the hostages.
I know one of the strategies that was employed was that some of our people, they referred to it as the October surprise, and began to talk about the possibility that it might happen, so that it got out in the press, so that if in fact it did happen, it wouldn't be so much of a surprise. It would take some of the sting out of it in terms of the politics of
The point man for this preventive strategy was the vice presidential nominee.
And one of the things that's in the back of everybody's mind, not just Republicans, is what can Carter do that is so sensational and so flamboyant, if you will, on his side, to pull off an October surprise. And everybody kind of speculates about it, but there's not a darn thing we can do about it, nor is there any strategy we can do, except possibly have it discounted.
Others in the Reagan-Bush campaign monitored Carter's hostage moves, as concern mounted that Carter might just pull off an October surprise.
We're not foolish. Of course, it was incumbent on us, running an election, to be aware of what might happen to derail or to dent in any way the kind of juggernaut victory that we expected to turn in.
Richard Allen was candidate Reagan's advisor on foreign policy during the campaign, and would later become President Reagan's first national security advisor. Allen denies knowledge of any Reagan campaign hostage deal, but in early October, for reasons that remain unclear, Allen agreed to a bizarre meeting with an Iranian emissary at a Washington hotel. Also at the meeting were Lawrence Silberman, later appointed by Reagan to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and Robert McFarlane, national security advisor at the start of the Iran-Contra affair. McFarlane and Silberman have refused to talk with Frontline.
What happened was that Bud McFarlane called me several times in an attempt to get me to meet with someone about the Iranian problem. I've said to McFarlane, I'll meet you in the L'Enfant Plaza Hotel, but only in the lobby, where there's plenty of people out there. And I was introduced to this very obscure character whose name I cannot recall. Eventually I will find the memorandum that I wrote on this meeting, but I haven't been able to find it yet. And the individual was either an Egyptian or an Iranian, or could have been an Iranian living in Egypt. And his idea was that he had the capacity to intervene, to deliver the hostages to the Reagan forces. Now, I took that at first to mean that he was able to deliver the hostages to Ronald Reagan, candidate for the presidency of the United States, which was absolutely lunatic. And I said so.
So I took it upon myself to contact Reagan Bush campaign.
Iranian-born arms dealer Houshang Lavi had previously brokered multi-billion-dollar U.S. weapons sales to Iran. An F-14 deal he made with the Shah was the only foreign sale of that advanced American aircraft. Lavi claimed to be the man who met with Allen, Silberman, and McFarlane.
I contacted Silberman and McFarlane and Allen. We had a meeting in L'Enfant Hotel in Washington. And Silberman knew me from a previous operation 2 years back. So in so many words, he told me that we have our own contacts. This is October 2nd, to the best of my recollection, of 1980.
For years, allegations of October 1980 meetings in Paris have been at the core of the hostage mystery. Some sources claim that these meetings put the finishing touches on the deal allegedly struck in Madrid. Living in exile in France, Iran's President Banisadr was the first to claim that the Reagan-Bush campaign sealed a secret deal with the Iranians in Paris. He did not mention Madrid.
If there had not been contacts with the Reagan-Bush group, the hostages would have been let go 6 months before the U.S. elections.
But Banisadr was short on proof, citing only a letter he had received from a colleague still in Iran.
It's a text which was sent a long time before the Iran Gate affair. No one knew at the time what was going on between the White House and Tehran. It says, point number 5, the various points are numbered. It was at the Hotel Raphael in Paris. He didn't give the exact date, but it was just before the 23rd of October.
Il s'agit de Hotel Raphael.
What was my interest was to know whether really it existed or not.
Nicholas Ignatiev, an acknowledged arms dealer, worked with French intelligence in the mid-1980s to gain the release of French hostages held in Lebanon. He told Frontline that he consulted his intelligence colleagues after hearing rumors of the Paris meetings.
I wanted to know about what we were speaking. And after having spoken with a few friends of mine, I was convinced that some very important meetings really took place, let us say between the 19th and the 22nd of October 1980 in Paris, in the Hotel Raphael first, and I think, and then 2 meetings in Florida. I heard that Mr. Casey was there, that Colonel Gregg was there.
Casey's old friend Marange, director of French intelligence, had also been Ignatiev's boss.
The reputation of the French Secret Service at that moment, in my opinion, was quite excellent, and I think that probably people like Casey, who knew Marange since a long time, could certainly find some help from him.
Richard Brennecke, an Oregon businessman with a specialty in laundering money, claims he attended one of the Paris meetings. Brennecke said that William Casey was giving the orders.
It was a case of, okay, you're going to get your weapons, we're going to get our hostages. Your weapons are going to get there as fast as we can get them to you. But we don't want the hostages right now. You are going to hold on to the hostages, and you are going to see that they are well treated.
Richard Brennecke first made his claims about the Paris meetings as a witness in a 1988 court case. In response, prosecutors charged him with 5 counts of lying to a federal judge about the meeting and who was there. Following a trial at the federal court in Portland, Oregon, Brennecke was found innocent of those charges in 1990.
They're pleased. We told the truth. We told the truth all along. And by God, it was believed.
Although Brennecke's credibility remains in question, government records show that he did work with European arms dealers supplying Iran during the 1980s. According to one document, Brennecke once informed a Pentagon intelligence officer about top-secret TOW missile sales to Iran 3 days before President Reagan secretly authorized them. Brennecke said a CIA contact sent him to Paris in October 1980 to launder money for the Reagan campaign's Iran arms deal.
Okay, the overall package was very simple. There were, and I added this up as I went along, somewhere between $35 and $40 million was going to change hands. That is, it would wind up being used either for the purchase of weapons to be given to Iran, delivered to Iran, or for specific Iranians' bank accounts. Casey at the time told me that I would have the authority to withdraw funds from a Mexican bank, and he says, and there probably will be an American bank or two involved in this whole thing. He said yes on virtually every handheld weapon that was asked for. He limited the number of TOW missiles in the initial shipments. They said yes. He said yes to specific aircraft spares. Tires were a big item.
At Brennecke's trial, the government tried and failed to prove that William Casey was not in Paris.
With Mr. Casey, they called 2 secretaries. Both of the secretaries stated they were employed by Mr. Casey, that they were employed approximately 40 hours a week, that they would see Mr. Casey almost every day.
Michael Scott was one of Brennecke's lawyers.
At least one of them admitted that Mr. Casey did have secrets from her. And I think the jury was smart enough to realize that if a gentleman was going to go to Paris to delay the release of 52 American hostages for the purpose of influencing a campaign, that he sure as hell wouldn't be dumb enough to admit it to his secretary.
Another startling Brennecke claim was that Casey was accompanied to Paris by a CIA officer, Donald Gregg, who was then assigned to President Carter's National Security Council staff. Gregg would later become the National Security Advisor to Vice President George Bush and is now ambassador to South Korea. He has emphatically denied Brennecke's claim, but declined to be interviewed for this broadcast. At the trial, Gregg claimed to have spent that October weekend at a Delaware beach. He offered as proof photographs of himself and his family in swimwear.
Oh, yes, it had a little stamp on the back that indicated it was developed, allegedly, during the month of October 1980. And everybody knows if you have a roll of film and you develop it that month, that means it had to have been taken that month, correct?
U.S. government documents show the weather was cold and cloudy that weekend on the Delaware shore. The defense called Bob Lynott, a weatherman, to testify.
Well, I think any meteorologist would have said, there's not much here to prove anything. The weather that prevailed in that area on those days of Saturday and Sunday in late October 1980 did not match what showed in those pictures.
The prosecution even sought to disprove that George Bush had joined the Paris meetings. Brennecke claimed no direct knowledge of Bush's presence, but had recounted the story of pilot friend Heinrich Rupp. Rupp and Israeli intelligence officer Ari Ben-Menashe still maintain they saw a man in Paris they believed to be Bush. Although Bush was under Secret Service protection as a vice presidential candidate, the government again fumbled the case.
They had two Secret Service witnesses testify that they were on the Secret Service team that was protecting the vice presidential candidate, George Bush, at the time. They didn't remember what hours they worked. They thought they were on duty that weekend, but they couldn't be sure. They were unable to, they didn't bother to bring their time cards or their time records. They didn't bother to bring their personal diaries that would have notations. And they weren't sure that they saw George Bush at any time during that weekend.
Though they were not introduced at the trial, heavily censored Secret Service documents obtained by Frontline show that Bush's detail went to a suburban Washington country club. But the papers do not specify with whom the candidate might have met, nor do they supply any other details as to who was actually in the party. Although the government couldn't provide convincing alibis for Casey, Gregg, and Bush, the acquittal of Brennecke did not prove they were in Paris. But other witnesses not involved in Brennecke's trial also contend that a deal was struck. Hushang Lavi says one result of the L'Enfant Plaza Hotel meeting with Reagan campaign aides in early October was a call from Cyrus Hashemi, the alleged Carter-Reagan double agent.
I went to meet first to London, then I joined Mr. Hashemi, and then we went together in Paris. We went to a hotel. I believe the name of the hotel was Lafayette Hotel somewhere in Paris. I could see that Mr. Hashemi had a number of meetings with some of his Iranian colleagues, as well as some Americans, as well as some French and Germans and what have you, and Israelis. But I did not interfere in any of those meetings. He told me that he wants to make a deal in order to get the release of the hostages from Khomeni in return of supply of arms to the government of Iran.
Lavi's claim to inside knowledge is buttressed by cryptic notations made by his lawyer, Mitchell Rogovin, only 2 days after the alleged Paris meetings.
October 21st, a foreign agent in Paris sold documents endangering U.S. and Israel. No release of anyone before election. Dash, want to talk to Bush. Do you know what these notes might mean?
I do know, sir, for a fact that Mr. Mitchell Rogovin is a very good friend of President Bush. That I know, because he has told me so.
Mitchell Rogovin was a lawyer at the CIA in the mid-1970s when George Bush was the agency's director.
There's a reference here, no release to anybody before election. I can't, I don't recall whether this is Lobby repeating someone else, Lobby speculating on his own, but it came from a conversation with Lobby, yes.
And doesn't it also say want to talk to Bush?
Yes, I don't know what that...
You don't know what he's talking about?
No.
Israeli intelligence officer Ari Ben-Menashe says he was one of half a dozen Israelis sent to Paris at Casey's request to help coordinate arms deliveries.
The Iranians were basically willing to release the hostages immediately. The Americans were saying we cannot release the money so quickly, keep the hostages till January. It will take time to release the money. Let's set a certain date in January for the release. The Iranians were saying, just give us the money, you can get your guys.
In January of 1981, I was summoned and issued a visa by the Iranian government on a piece of paper to go to Tehran.
William Herman is an American arms dealer who has cooperated in the past with U.S. intelligence. He says he learned of the Paris meetings from an official Iranian arms procurer, Hamid Nagashian, on the day after Reagan's inauguration.
Nagashian told me that a deal was struck by the Reagan administration in October 1980, before the election, not to release the hostages until after you sworn in. And I believe that he was telling the truth, due to the fact that at that time they had nothing to lose or nothing to gain. The hostages were gone, and whatever transpired prior to the release apparently was immaterial to them.
The Iranian government agreed to make its officials available for interviews with Frontline, but only if no questions were asked about the hostages or the events of 1980. For Gary Sick, it was the sheer number of accounts about the alleged hostage deal which persuaded him to take a second look.
I think it was something like 15 different people that I've either talked to or have had evidence from indirectly on this subject, who in fact claim that personal knowledge that this happened. There are a very large number of very respectable people who really do believe that this happened. There are other people who claim to have direct knowledge that it happened. And those individuals, for the most part, tend to be people who are money movers, arms dealers, low-level intelligence operatives, people who work undercover, and who, for one reason or another, are now dissatisfied with their lot and are prepared to talk about some of what they knew, perhaps with considerable exaggeration. And I finally, I guess, passed a point where it was harder to explain away the people who were supposedly all lying to me for reasons that I couldn't understand than it was to believe that something in fact happened.
Our position is, and I think it's proper, and it should be the position of every American, we want those hostages home now. We have had a period of national shame and disgrace for almost a year, and we want those hostages out, and we want them out now, and it transcends politics, Republican, Democrat, or Independent.
Only days before the election, polls showed the race was neck and neck.
That election was, based on our polls and on the Republicans' polls, dead even about a week or 10 days out from Election Day. So if something, whatever it had been, quite positive where I thought of it had happened during that period, I think it's reasonable to assume that it might have made the difference.
But unfortunately for President Carter, the Iranian parliament was dragging its heels. The initiative of Tabatabai, the deal which Carter had agreed to, ran into a brick wall of radical opposition.
All of a sudden, it was just strung out indefinitely with absolutely no action at all. They weren't coming back and asking us for new positions. They weren't in contact with us. They were just going about it in their own way, and nothing was happening in Tehran from mid-October on.
If you recall, Khomeini said that the parliament could itself resolve the question of the hostages. They met in June and could have taken action back then. Why then were there 9 more months of delay?
Ahmad Salamatian was a delegate to Parliament.
I felt daily that at the center of Parliament they hesitated. I was in Parliament myself. I saw them delay any resolution. The hostages could have been released in June, and under conditions even more favorable to Iran. We didn't do it. The vote which took place in Parliament only a day or so before the U.S. elections was too late to help Jimmy Carter.
Exactly 1 year to the day after the hostages were seized, Jimmy Carter went down to defeat at the polls. The confinement of the Americans continued for another 2.5 months.
Well, this administration's objective will be a healthy, vigorous, growing economy that provides equal
On
opportunity.
January 20th, 1981, Iranians listened to Ronald Reagan give his inaugural address. The Americans headed home.
Putting all Americans back to work.
Conclusive proof of a secret hostage deal is elusive, but arms did flow to Iran after Reagan's inauguration.
My own personal first-hand knowledge starts when I'm Assistant Secretary of State in early February 1981.
Nicholas Veliotis was Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East at the start of the Reagan administration.
And within a few months, we received a press report from TASS that an Argentinian plane had crashed. And according to the documents, crashed in Soviet territory. This was chartered by Israel, and it was carrying American military equipment to Iran. And it was clear to me, after my conversations with people on high, that indeed we had agreed that the Israelis could transship to Iran some American origin military equipment.
It remains unclear who authorized these and other weapons sales.
I have a sneaking suspicion that somebody in the White House winked.
Alexander Haig was President Reagan's first Secretary of State. He claims that he sent a clear message to Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon.
I forbade it, and I had the right to.
Well, did you ever sit down and say, I want to get to the bottom of this? I want to know if...
Yes, oh, of course. I said it to Sharon. I said, now I have a reported. And
he
also...
said...
No?
He said they did not
No.
ship.
No.
But then later on, he and Ahrens both claimed that there were shipments made by Israel with American approval.
Well, it wasn't my approval, and it wasn't the Secretary of State's approval when I was Secretary of State. But I've already drawn for you a picture that would suggest there was nothing unusual about that.
But doesn't that upset you a bit that here's a man, Sharon, that you've dealt with and you have friendship with, and he would mislead you on something as important as whether or not...
Oh, no. The conduct of that kind of thing? No, come on. Jesus, God, you better get out and read Machiavelli or somebody else, because I think you're living in a dream world. People do what their national interest tells them to do. And if it means lying to a friendly nation, they're going to lie through their teeth.
An officer on the State Department's Israeli desk, David Satterfield, said that Secretary Haig did not flatly forbid Israeli transshipment of U.S. weapons to Iran. Satterfield was interviewed years later by Iran-Contra investigators, and Frontline has obtained a copy of his still classified statement. Satterfield said that Haig told Israel that in principle this was okay, but only for F-4 spare parts. Haig also insisted that the United States had to approve in advance specific lists of parts to be sold by Israel to Iran. By spring 1982, American officials were to object that the Israelis had gone too far. But by then, Satterfield said, approximately $53 million in weapons and parts had been sent to Iran, most of which were not within the agreed-upon guidelines. A senior Israeli intelligence official told Frontline that in 1981 and 82, a wide range of American equipment flowed covertly through Israel to Iran. The equipment included spare parts for F-4 fighter planes, for M-48 tanks, and for M-113 armored personnel carriers. This source put the value of the material at $246 million. Some principals in the 1980 hostage intrigue rushed to cash in by selling weapons to Iran. A 1984 federal indictment would charge that Cyrus Hashemi started arranging arms shipments as early as October 21st, 1980, 2 days after the alleged Paris meetings. It was part of said conspiracy that defendant Cyrus Hashemi would procure defense-related items for export from the United States to Iran. But Cyrus never stood trial. The charges dropped in exchange for his cooperation on another Iran arms case. Houshang Lavi also pushed his way into the long line of weapons dealers feeding Iran's hungry war machine. Lavi told Frontline that American military equipment was even pulled directly from NATO warehouses.
Anything that they could not supply from Israel, they would supply from Belgium. Iranians would come there, they would be taken to NATO bases, particularly the bases in the border in Belgium and Germany, and they would pick whatever they want, and the Belgium would ship it to Iran.
Like a shopping expedition?
That's correct.
What would they just say, we want that electron tube over
yes,
here?
Yes, sir. Believe you me, sir, I swear to God, I've seen this with my own eyes.
So reports about Iranian representatives going in and saying, with people from these various warehouses and making sure that certain equipment's there which can then be shipped to Iran would be on its face preposterous to you, or is it something that might be there?
Well, no, it wouldn't be preposterous if a nation, Germany, for example, decided to let some of their NATO stockpiles be diverted to Iran. They'd have total control over such a decision. It would surprise me very much if American-controlled equipment were transshipped from Europe to Iran. I would be very surprised.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States and the 53 freed Americans.
Safely back in the United States, the men and women held in Iran enjoyed their freedom. Although stories of a Republican deal circulated, they never gained wide acceptance. Even when Congress and the press examined Reagan's Iran-Contra arms deal with Iran in 1986, investigators avoided probing too deeply into the origins of the Reagan-Iran contacts.
I resisted believing these stories for more than 8 years, even though I was involved in them and I studied the issues and I was there at the time and I watched it. I didn't want to believe that American politics could or would be played this way. Curiously enough, I've had the same thing said to me by any number of non-Americans that I've talked to, that they found it hard to believe that something like this could happen in the United States. But if it did, it's it's sad. It's a very, very sad reflection on our system, and that makes me sad. It really does.
The 1980 hostage mystery might never be solved. After 10 years, no smoking gun has been found proving that the Reagan campaign struck a deal with the Khomeni regime. Yet the corroborative accounts of so many people make the allegations difficult to explain.